government in place, but very much a place that has had similar polycrises as the ones that we're facing. And one of the things I asked Prof. Kumar is, well, what's the thing that led to there being now these mass protests and people swimming in the president's swimming pool? Like, what was the thing that triggered it? And he said there'd been, food, their inflation's at 50%, so food prices were insane. Farmers couldn't get any fertilizer, and Sri Lanka's a 77% rural country. But then there were just blackouts. He said there were 13 hours of blackouts a day. And at that point, people went and swam in the president's swimming pool. Like, that was it. And I thought, oh, damn. In Joburg, we're 1 hour away from that. But a lot of the conversation that we had earlier, and this is why I'm starting with it, is I think these, organizing this conversation that we're having, and in every conversation, in many of the conversations that I'm in, people are wondering, what's it going to take? Like, what's the straw that's going to break the camel's back? What is that one thing that's just going to set off the inferno in South Africa? Because it feels like we're in this series of compounding crises. And we all talk about it. We know that there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of protests in South Africa every year. But there's a sense of impending inferno, that at some point it's all going to blow up. And it feels closer to blowing up than ever before. I had someone say to me 2 days ago, who's in one of these big corporates, who said, well, there's a secret memo going around from Eskom saying that the big blackout is coming in a month. So he said, like with lockdown, go shop. You need to buy toilet paper and tins and everything, because it's going to take them at least 3 weeks to get the grid going if it all shuts down. So we won't be able to go to the shops. And it was this very panicked thing. That may be a tip for all of you, I don't know. So maybe you want to go to Macro tomorrow. But the sense of impending doom. And I have been asked to speak about the state of the state, and I'm going to focus on 3 things. The first, and I think that these 3 things are contributing to the sense of impending doom. The first is the collapse of the state, that the administration of our government is not functioning adequately. In some places, it's not functioning at all 3 levels of government. So that's the first thing I'm going to speak about. The second thing is about the state's loss on the monopoly of violence, of legitimate violence. In political theory, when I teach first years and you teach them about Max Weber and his conception of the state, and one of the key features of a state, it's within territorial borders, certain territorial boundaries. There's a central government. It has sovereignty. And the state has a monopoly. It is only the state that has the legitimacy to use violence. So that generally relates to the military, that there's an armed forces and there's a police force. I'm going to argue that South Africa has lost that. Or we're very close to losing it. And the third thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of the state of the state is that the state appears to have lost its convening authority. So the instruments and the institutions of the state that should be able to bring together different parts of civil society, business, all other actors, don't seem to be able to play that role. And I'm going to focus here particularly on Parliament. So on the first thing, and because I took, as my friend likes to say, I cleared my throat for a long time, so I don't have a lot of time to talk about what I actually want to talk about. So I'm going to try to do this in like 5 or 6 minutes. On the first thing, on the state of the state. For a number of different reasons, including the non-professionalization of our civil service, which started actually for pretty reasonable reasons in 1994. There was a dismantling of the apartheid system of civil service recruitment and promotion, and necessarily so, because if it hadn't been dismantled, there'd be no black people in the civil service. But the idea was always that was a temporary thing and was something that was meant to apply primarily to senior levels, so Director General level to a certain degree, Deputy Director General, Chief Director level in the civil service. What we've seen since 2009, so since the Zuma presidency, so before then, between 1994 and 2007, 8-ish, you had a very politicized layer of senior civil service in the sense that they were cadres, that were directors general, were appointed by the president. President Mbeki was the line manager for all directors general, not their ministers. And you had, but they all had to be qualified, have some experience, all the rest of it, have experience in what they were doing, all the rest of it. But below a certain level, below senior management service, it was a pretty meritocratic, maybe may not be the right, but you applied for a job and if you got, and there was systems for how you grew up, right? And that's everything from the person who made tea right up to the people that were researchers or the rest of it. You start having a dismantling of that. In 2009 for many, many reasons. And we are now at a point in 2023 where the national administration is politicized all the way down, right down to who gets a cleaning job. In some municipalities, whether you get a cleaning job or you get the job to make tea depends on who you are related to or close to in party structures, or quite frankly, who you're sleeping with. So we've had a complete dismantling of whatever vestiges of professionalization there were in the system. There have been some parts of government that have been able to hold on to it, but overall, not so much, which is why, and we see this reflected then, in many different things. In the Gauteng government, in Gauteng in January, there was a big article in the Daily Maverick saying that ICU nurses were striking because they hadn't been paid. And why hadn't they been paid? So they were refusing to work overtime. Why hadn't they been paid? Because they are outsourced, so the agency hadn't been paid before Christmas. That's an administrative failure. That's not even corruption. That's somebody not doing their job. This paper that was meant to be signed on the day it was not signed, and so a bunch of ICU nurses were not paid, and so Charlotte Maxleke's ICU, this is Charlotte Maxleke's ICU, was just not functional for like a week or whatever until that got resolved. What we're seeing in the police, somebody was saying that the way in which promotion works in the police at the moment is that you're guaranteed to get promoted every 2 years regardless of performance. So then we're surprised that our police stations don't function. So there are these very basic levels of state capacity that are missing. And I say to civil society groups every time I speak to them is that you can litigate against the state all you want. You can win every court case. But there is not the capacity to do better in the state. And until we get interested in that, we're not going to get out of the crisis that we're in. We need to have a proper, and we need to turn this into a political issue. You know, the National School of Governance, Busani Ngcaweni, who is the principal of the National School of Governance, says a framework on professionalization of the civil service that's been accepted by cabinet. But there's no pressure onto cabinet to actually implement it. And until we all link the issues that we're dealing with, whether it's water or school sanitation, to the fact that our state is incapable of responding to the needs of the people because it does not have capacity. Until we link those two issues, there's no political pressure for anyone to do differently. So that's the state of the state. The second thing is, and building on that, is the state's loss of its monopoly on legitimate violence. Western Cape people, I don't even need to tell you this, right? Like anyone in Cape Town knows that SAPS doesn't function. We have more private security, we have more trained and registered private security officers than we have police. I sit on the board of the Private Security Industry Regulating Authority. It has been mind-blowing to see how much private security is doing basic state policing and security work. The report of the committee, the inquiry on the causes that was chaired by Prof. Sandy Africa on the causes of what led up to the July unrest in 2021 is so revealing about the lack of intelligence capacity, about how the first responders in pretty much all cases, were private security. So we have a bunch of private security corporations mostly, but also smaller actors, who are the ones who are keeping the state safe. And although there has been recruitment of new police officers, the training is completely inadequate. And the same issues that we see at other levels of the state in terms of the lack of professionalization and administrative capacity are playing out. And so, which is why we are seeing then this increase or a more brazen, I mean, South Africa is a gangster state, it always has been, you know, that whole thing, Paul Kruger was the original Mr. 10%, you know, like it always has been. But we're seeing an increasing brazenness of organized crimes, interference in governance and in the basic running of the country. Then I'm going to finally end with the crisis for me of the state's ability to convene all different actors. How long has President Ramaphosa been speaking about the compact, the social compact? The state has not the ability to put that together. And Parliament, for me, in the last 3 years, we haven't been paying enough attention to just the weakening of Parliament. And to my mind, and having, when I was a baby intern working with Stefans and other people, there were some excellent parliamentarians from all parties. Parliament as an institution worked. It no longer does so. There was a vacancy for the Secretary of Parliament for 7 years. We finally have one, George, and he's great. But he is rebuilding a very broken institution. I think the Parliament we've had since 2019, parliamentarians from all parties, it's been the weakest one. Parliament basically checked out in 2020 with COVID. And so the kind of bringing people together, but then also holding account that Parliament should be doing, it's not doing. And I think that's something that we need to put on the agenda before we elect our next parliamentarians in 2024. I'm going to end there.
Thanks. Lots of food. Tessa, can I ask you to talk about the state of our politics broadly that flows from the scenario that Stimbile has sketched? You want to use the mic? Okay.
All right. So I'm going to start the picture I want to paint about our politics with 4 bad Ds and 4 hopeful Rs. So let's see how this goes. What is the state of our politics? For me, it boils down to 4 things. The first is disillusionment. South Africans generally across the board have become disillusioned, not just with one political party or 2 political parties or a few political parties, with democracy, with the entire idea of a democratic country that has institutions and all of the things that those institutions do at a government level, at an electoral level, even at a community participation level to some extent. People don't believe democracy works anymore. There's this general feeling that we've been sold a dud when it comes to democracy. And that for me is a devastating thing. Because it's one thing for people to say, you know, we don't like the president, or we're disillusioned by the party, or even we're disillusioned by party politics. People are saying this whole thing doesn't work. And so we're checking out in mass from our joint democratic project to build a common, cohesive South Africa. And that for me is a very worrying thing. More worrying than anything else in our politics is that. Because without a society that is plugged into a collective project to build the future, you're just getting more and more decay. You're getting more and more demoralized actors whose level of care is going to go down, right? So the IEC will tell us that there's now over 600 political parties registered in the country. In 2021, we had over 320 political parties that contested. And while that might look like people are still interested in some level of politics, what it also indicates is that people are going towards a very micro politics that's a lot of times about identity politics, nationalized politics. Think about 320 versions of Dudula and the PA. Some more benevolent than others. But that's not a good thing in terms of us all pulling together. We're pulling apart, right? And I'm going to talk about why some of that is still good for us a bit later, but I think that for me is the most important thing, because politics isn't just about parties. It's about people and people feeling empowered within the nation to do something, and I think we're losing that. The second D is dysfunction, and I think Ste's given us a really good platform for the level of dysfunction. But let's use a really recent example, the cabinet reshuffle. How many ministers does it take to put in a light bulb? We really don't have the answer, right? We don't even know what the point of that level of political power is anymore. Because literally, it's a free fall. It's like, I have no clear sense of what this administration is trying to do at a level of political vision and direction, and what these different people are meant to be doing, right? We are actually proliferating the problems when you have a cluster of 5 ministers responsible for economic policy. That's where we are. There are 5 different ministries that are all supposed to be building the economy. But each of them has got a political principle that's interested more in their own political career than a collective vision. And you have a president that is fairly checked out. So our dysfunction politically is really high. And then you take that and cascade it down. By the time we get to municipal levels, the level of our politics at the municipal level is not only lacks professionalism and capacity, it's just deadly. People are killing each other to be councillors to get 10,000 rand a month. That's where we are. And so there's a dysfunction about our politics that we need to reckon with. Another part of that dysfunction that I'm sure Minaj will touch on is the sense that we have representatives, political representatives, that represent no one in particular. They represent themselves at best. They represent people, in their circles, but they have no reason to believe that they represent the public. And so the public doesn't have a relationship to its representatives. I remember just before the 2021 election, we were doing some political education engagements, and somebody in a township in Johannesburg said, I don't want to vote because what happens if I vote for this councillor and this councillor decides that they're just going to disappear out of my community, they're not going to do their work, and then I'm stuck with them for 5 years, and there's nothing in law that gives me the power to recall them. And that's a basic thing. That's a basic thing where people just don't feel represented. And so there's a dysfunction in our politics. The next is that we're demobilized. Now, one of the things I love about South African communities is that we've kept going at community level despite a broken society, right? So a basic example in African communities is weddings, funerals, and stokvels. People organize. And they organize for those three things like you'll never see. And a relative of mine, a cousin of mine, passed away last year. And I watched his community in Ennerdale mobilize to bury him. And the question I was left with was, why didn't we mobilize to keep him alive? Like, we're not mobilizing for change, but we have the capacity to. We've also become demobilized in terms of connecting with each other. Again, the reason why we have these splintering political parties and movements and all of this all over the country is because we've lost the ability to mobilize together upward, right? And to connect to each other. And there's a lot of factors in that in terms of our racial divides, our geographic divides, our cultural divides. Our political interests are just not aligned enough in the country. I've been saying that my favorite thing about load shedding is that for the first time in a long time, we are all on the same page about one thing, regardless of our backgrounds, right? But we can lose that very quickly if we don't use the moment to actually build solidarity. Because the moment we get opportunity, because if we think about this really, most middle-class South Africans are buying their way out of the system, right? So from private security to healthcare that's private, to schools that are private, electricity is the last bastion that it's hard to buy your way out of. And so we're buying our way out of the common, of our collective. And I think we need to find our collective again. And then the final one is the stress and trauma. As Rivonia Circle, we went around the country extensively last year, just speaking to communities. And the word trauma comes up so often when people describe democracy and their democratic experience in South Africa. And that's a big problem. Because part of people's resistance to participation is that they're already hurt. The whole thing is hurting. And now you're asking me to get involved in struggle again. No, like I'm a wounded bird. Now you want me to be a wounded bird that goes out there and is trying to catch snakes. It's really difficult. I've been speaking to a lot of people who participated in Fees Must Fall. Young people who were just like, I have opted to look after me, myself, and my family because that thing of trying to be revolutionary was too painful. Watching the state come after me and try to harm me for change. Watching a black government try and do the things that we only thought an apartheid government would do was too much. So there's trauma. So I want to get to the 4 hopeful R's quickly so that we get into conversation. But I just want to say 2 things. One is that we do need a different conception of politics in this country that expands politics beyond political parties and politicians. Everybody needs to recognize that everything is political and all of us have some sort of power that we can use. And it goes beyond protest, it goes beyond resistance. It has to be a politics about the future and about building better futures. The antidote to trauma is hope, as esoteric as it sounds. But we have to build a politics that looks different and looks healthier and looks more hopeful and give every one of us something to look forward to and move towards. And that's how I'm going to get to the 4 R's for the future. The first is that we need to get representation right. So part of the good thing about this 325 parties and independent candidates wanting to contest is that the signal from society is we want politics that is close to us, politicians we know, and people we can hold accountable. My father is 80, and he didn't vote in the last election because he said, I don't know these people. I want to know who they are. And so we need representation that's much closer to people's lives, not this superstar celebrity politician stuff that we're doing right now, waiting for the next messiah and all of that. That's not what we need. So representation needs to be closer, and it needs to be more accountable. The second thing is that we need to think about the future and reconfigure the future, right? The aim is not just to resist degradation or further decay of our society. It must be to build something different. It must be to do more than what we have or have had. And I think a reconfiguring of what the future can be, we call it South Africa 2.0, an imagining of a future is important. The next thing is we need to have a conversation about reform and revolution. And this is something that a group of young people have put into my mind in the last week or so, where they said, well, for the last few years, decade or two, we've been thinking about reforms, little incremental things. And the state of crisis is so great that reforms are not going to cut it. We're going to have things that radically shift us, that move us in radical directions to things that look completely different from the reality we know. Tweaking things is not going to work. Sorry. Tweaking is not going to work, right? And so we're going to have the boldness for revolution. And revolution is not just about taking to the streets. And again, I think Manaj will touch on this when we look at examples around the world of where we've seen, the Brazil moment and, things just going woof, woof. We need that. People need that. All of us need something radically different from what we're experiencing right now. But whatever revolutionary ideas we come up with need to channel our energies. It can't just be, random riotousness. And the channeling of that energy is my last R, which I call radical solidarity. My greatest appeal to especially us who have some level of privilege in the society, and I say all of us in this room because your ability to get here says that, and that's hard for me to even say, but it's just true, is that we're going to have to realize that every South African problem is my problem. And that I don't have the option of tapping out, even if I realistically could. Because particularly as a black person, even if I tapped out and left, I assure you my black tax is still going to keep me connected to the country in some way or the other. Let the July 21 riots remind us that if the whole does not hold, it doesn't matter how privileged you are, your life won't be good in this country. So we need radical solidarity and commit to solving problems that are not our own. So that's where I'll end for now.
Right. Just over to Manaj to talk a little bit about the structure of our politics, the rules and regulations, the changes, and how some of those help or hinder the kind of change that we need and that Tessa's talking about. Over to you, Manaj. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. It's an honor to be here on the platform with these two, and the first amaB town hall since COVID, before COVID. I want to latch on to a lot of what Tessa had said through her talk, especially what she said at the beginning. So Tessa spoke about one of the fundamental crisis in this country is a disillusionment with democracy. Very few people in this country trust democracy, and most people in this country would opt for a dictatorship if they were to receive services, etc. There's also a serious mistrust in institutions. As our institutions fall apart, the judiciary, the state-owned enterprises, parliament, president, people lose trust, and there's a serious mistrust in the state and all arms of the state, including, for example, the IEC, one of the functional state-owned enterprises that's holding elections, and we can't afford to lose elections, and we're seeing mistrust in the IEC, we're seeing attempts to undermine the IEC. That's going to worsen in the next few years. And I think the third important thing that this crisis, this polycrisis has brought about is a discrediting of forms of progressive politics, politics that speak to collectivism, politics that allows us to imagine a new society, one that's rooted in a distribution of wealth, one that's rooted in solidarity, etc. In fact, it's forcing people to retreat and to isolate. And I'll come back to that a bit later. I want to touch on a few important moments before I speak about the politics of it. So despite all of this, there are signs that our democracy works, or elements of it works, and has worked. And some of the most important signs are the ways that South African society has managed to organize. In the 90s, the most important example was the Treatment Action Campaign, which organized working class communities, in particular, rural communities, women, towards forcing an inept, inadequate, deeply neoliberalized state to provide ARVs for everyone. The second was Marikana that happened in the Zuma era, and I think Marikana is a metaphor for how South African society is organized. The state, well, firstly, workers, mine workers, rejected the organized union that they were part of, because the leaders of that union was co-opted by capital and co-opted by the state. And workers realized that they need to organize themselves beyond the bureaucracy of the union, beyond the bureaucracy of money and capital. And workers appealed both to the state and to capital. And the state protected the capital and ended up murdering 37 workers. That was a crucial moment in our politics and in our society, a crucial historical moment, where we saw the rise of many things. It was the beginning of the end of Jacob Zuma. We saw the rise of the EFF. We saw the split of still the biggest labor federation in the country, COSATU, because NUMSA broke away. And the third important political moment, historical moment that I want to speak about is Fees Must Fall. So I think the important thing about Fees Must Fall is for the first time, at least in my activism, people who represented a very small sector of society, students, but a sector of society who others listen to, who the media listen to, who plays a big role in defining politics, organized with workers, with cleaners, etc., in order to push for not small university-based demands, but broader demands. The students of 2015 and 2016 forced South African society to put the way we think about the world on trial, and to reimagine a new world. Of course, that collapsed because we weren't able to use that moment effectively to extend that organization to communities, to women groups, to women's groups, etc. And then the other crucial moment is 2021, July 2021, the July riots, which was sparked, of course, by the arrest of Jacob Zuma, but developed a mass character afterwards. Developed a mass character that was fueled by hunger, that was fueled by poverty, that was fueled by mass unemployment. Again, we saw, like we did with the Fees Must Fall movement, we saw a crisis of political imagination. We weren't able to use the mass character of those riots to organize towards a better society. And that became incredibly violent and incredibly unsustainable. A few months after the July riots, which took place mostly in KZN and part of Gauteng, a small number of us went to the polls in one of the most important elections since 1994, the local government election in 2021. And those elections told us three things, showed us three things about our society. The first is we saw the lowest voter turnout in the history of our democracy. Only around 28% of eligible voters actually went to the polls and voted, 28%. The second thing is that the ruling party, the governing party, Former Liberation Movement, the ANC, whose politics is rooted in patronage networks, for the first time lost its national share of the vote below 50%. And the third thing is these things gave rise to largely unstable coalitions across the country. And all of this speaks to a very serious political crisis, which has a few characteristics. The first is that it shows us, if you look at how people voted and why people didn't vote, in the main, in the areas where people didn't vote, it's people who would ordinarily vote for the ANC. So it's former ANC voters who didn't vote, firstly as a rejection of the ANC, secondly because they'd rather stay at home than vote for any of these other guys. That's so there's no alternative. There's a hole in our politics that needs to be filled. And we don't see any alternative in our current politics. We have the Democratic Alliance, which is becoming more and more a right-wing, ethnic party that represents a very small minority. There's an offshoot of the DA in the form of Action SA, which organizes around anti-immigrant, sort of Trumpian politics, which people are buying into because of the stuff that Tessa spoke about. And then you have the cruder version of the ANC in the form of the EFF. There's no genuine, sustainable political party or even politics that represents the aspirations of majority of people in this country. And that's the crux of the political crisis. But all these things, I think, does present opportunities, and I think two main opportunities. The first is that it's an opportunity to build this alternative that I'm speaking about, this political alternative. But this does require a few things. I'm not going to repeat a lot of them because Tessa spoke to them. The first is organization, and organization from the ground up. And a lot of this has happened, and a lot of this is happening in the form of Fees Must Fall, in the form of many successful labor movements, in the form of the mining-affected communities united in action, mostly in the north of the country, Abahlali Basamjondolo, which organizes shack dwellers, the biggest social movement in the country, Equal Education, which organizes learners from across the country, and community movements. Tessa spoke about how communities organize. Community movements and community organizations and religious organizations. So any such political alternative needs to be a coalition of all these structures, and needs to organize behind a minimum program, behind an imagination that's progressive and that all these different structures can agree to. And this coalition needs to do a few things. The first, in the context of democracy falling apart, it needs to take the banner of democracy to people, to communities. It needs to develop this minimum program that's long-term, that forces hope, that forces imagination, that's rooted in solidarity, that's rooted in the redistribution of wealth, and that is sustainable, and that counters the push for people to retreat behind gated suburbs, towards xenophobia, etc. The second important opportunity, just to say that I think this process of organizing an alternative takes resources and takes incredible amount of time, and this is not going to happen before I think our most important election since 1994, 2024. But we need to start building that in this moment. The second is coalitions, and we're seeing what's happening with coalitions, incredibly unstable. But that's simply because we don't know how to do coalitions. Politicians are politically immature. We don't have sufficient rules for coalitions. All these agreements that the DA and the EFF and the ANC have is being signed behind closed doors, and none of the constituencies know what's happening. So there needs to be rules on how coalitions are organized, which don't exist currently because of how immature our politics are. But I think as voters, we also haven't been able to use coalitions effectively. And this is where the opportunity comes. The one thing that the precarious and unstable nature of coalitions gives us is it makes politicians' ability to hold onto power much more precarious. So votes become more valuable. So political parties, politicians will do more for constituencies, will do more for the people that vote for them. So the one I think for me, the most important opportunity that this political crisis gives us, and lack of legislation around the political crisis, is an opportunity to go to next year's elections and vote strategically, vote behind collective demands. And just to end off by saying, I think the next, in the context of what my two colleagues have said, the next year is the most important year in the history of this country and the history of our politics. We need to organize, we need to imagine, and we need to build solidarity. And how we do it in the next year will define whether we move towards a failed state, or whether we move towards a more prosperous society. Thank you.
Thanks, Minaj. So the question we're left with now is what is to be done? And I hear Minaj suggesting that there are these kind of embryonic movements and organizations out there. But the question maybe to throw back to Stembile and Tessa, you know, if one thinks of the formation of the UDF, etc., the point that you made about there is no convening authority, the state isn't, but is there another one that can do that? Is there a convening authority that can bring these disparate strands together around you know, a new vision?
And maybe Tessa, you will, because Tessa's a generally more optimistic person than I am. So at the moment, I would say no, there isn't. And I think that that's one of the big questions we need to ask ourselves is why, right? So we know that in the 1970s, 1980s, the South African Council of Churches and others, there were a few, you know, 2, 3, 4 trusted organizations that could be that convening authority. I'm not sure who that is now. And I think, yeah, there's something there about why that isn't. I wanted to say, though, that so what Tessa was saying around the radical solidarity, and that load shedding is that issue that everybody's experiencing. I think our discourse around it, though, is missing the solidarity. Because there's some people who've been load shed for the last 16 years. Johannesburg is having issues with water because the load shedding is affecting the pump system. So the Vaal Dam is full, it's overflowing, but we can't get water from the Vaal Dam to the reservoirs into people's homes. And like in suburbia, I live in Parkhurst, so like dramas all the time about the water. I am supervising a PhD student who is from a town outside, see me, I grew up in Joburg, so I also forget things, Lichtenburg, in the northwest. Her brother was born in 2000. They haven't had running water in their taps at home since 2003. So her brother has never lived in a house until he went to university. He'd never lived in a home. And these are, I mean, her mom's a teacher. We're not talking the poorest of the poor here. Her brother started living in a place where you opened the tap, and the water came out whenever you opened it, when he went to boarding school. So there are places in this country that have been in load shedding, that have been water shedding constantly. And I think that those of us, or those parts of our society that are experiencing this now, are not approaching it with enough humility about the, you know, yes, we want everybody to struggle together, but actually, this is almost the last stage of the dysfunction that it's affecting suburbia. And we need some basic acknowledgement of that in order to then be able to build a solidarity. And so whoever would convene, I think, would need to put that on the agenda and something to think about. But the second thing I want to say, and to Tessa's point around the privatization of our lives, a friend whose cousins are very wealthy, and these are black people, so executives. She had her nieces and nephews, and this friend is, you know, she and I consider each other the same class, right? And I'm an academic, I'm fine. She had her nieces and nephews over at her house, and she had load shedding. And they were shook. These are 10, 11, 12-year-olds. Who are like, what's going on? Where's the solar? Is your inverter broken? These are kids, black children, who are not experiencing load shedding. Because they live in Stain City, and they live in Waterfall. These are estates in Johannesburg, where there's solar, there's Tesla batteries, and there are inverters. They are living a reality that perhaps no one in this room even is living. And so that's become our default solution to things, right, is to privatize as much as possible. So I think that an urgent conversation and an urgent consideration for civil society in particular is about where are those convening spaces and how do we get everybody there? Because we're not going to be able to get out of this crisis, and this is where I'm going to end, without having at least some of those with resources see themselves as citizens of the country. Because as Minaj says, organizing takes a lot of money. I mean, I'm not going to dress it up. And we need to have at least some of those. It's never going to be all of them. Care enough to be able to join in with the communities that they need to in order to start imagining differently and imagining different futures.
Tessa, do you want to respond to some of that?
Yeah. And the last thought that went through my mind is going to be a problematic one, but let's start there. So I've been known to say in the last few months that the two things that we need most urgently to organize better is a new UDF and a Black AfriForum. So if you want to know who's best placed right now to convene society, it's Afrikaners. Afrikaner nationalists have been organizing the whole goddamn time and are like just replete with examples of what their organizing gets them, right? And part of that is banding together around ideas, but also banding together around resources, right? And so I say that with a heavy heart, but that's kind of where we are, right? It's the reason why FF Plus is on the rise, not on the decline in this country. And so there's something about the progressive left that is somehow missing the organizing bus because we've decided not to organize together. We've decided to organize for ourselves. Like as progressives, I have no idea why we're organizing for ourselves rather than organizing for a collective future. It's weird that when people have bad intentions or bad politics, and we've seen it around the world. We've seen the Trump wave of people with bad politics just organizing and organizing and organizing. We saw the Bolsonaro moment of people with poor politics, man. Politics that's not for everyone. But they organize. And I think we need to really assess how willing we are to organize together in progressive spaces, especially across class lines. Especially across class lines. Because the resource question, guys, every time I speak to people who organized during apartheid, they go, you don't need money to organize. And I'm like, Oaks, I don't know what you're talking about, but you need money to organize. Especially in a country where so many people are poor and unemployed. People are having to make a decision between whether they organize for what is right or whether they just survive and feed themselves and their families. And what we've done over the years is we've left the most difficult of organizing, the most taxing of organizing, the most time and cost resource intensive organizing to the most marginalized in our society. When we ask the question, who's going to go to the streets, it's the people who don't have the time or the money to go to the streets. I can tell you now, this city is known for protests. But getting taxis to get people to go to a protest costs somebody money. And that's because those people aren't going to be able to pay for that taxi themselves because they have to feed themselves or their children from a base that's very low. So progressives, if there's going to be some kind of outcome here, all of our neighborhood watches, SGBs, all of that organizing we're doing, we need to put it onto the same pot, right? The last thing I want to say about this is it's not that we need to wait for who will convene us. We need to also start asking, what will we convene about, right? And so a friend of ours in CU4 in the US says we need to decide, especially in light of an election coming up, not who's going to be on the ballot, but what will be on the ballot. What are going to be the issues that we are going to make the prize around which we organize and around which we choose representatives? You start saying to representatives, these are the things that we care about, and if you don't care about what we care about, you don't get our vote. And those who get our vote will do so because they care about it, and if that means we have to put ourselves on the ballot, we will. But we need to start deciding what we are organizing around, and I think that will help us organize better in this moment.
Just to Tessa's point about resources, I don't think we've understood and really grasped as a country what our unemployment rate is doing, what unemployment is doing to the social fabric. I talked about churches. Workplaces were places of organizing. There were factories. I mean, all down here. When I used to come to Cape Town as a kid in the late 80s, there were factories all on these roads and going into Salt River and into... that's not there anymore. And people used to meet and organize and politically influence each other at work. And so when 70% of young people are unemployed, when over 60% of that 70% of unemployed young people says they have to choose between looking for a job and going to an interview and eating, there's no excess. When you're not getting a pay packet on a Friday, and my grandpa used to get his pay packet on Friday and then could take out a R5 note to put away for a something. When you're not getting regular income, it's really hard. There's no excess. We've got a huge chunk of our society, and the ones that we're placing the burden of organizing on, who have no fat, like there's nothing. There's not even a basic. There's the 350 if social development is giving it to you regularly. And so the economic situation that the majority are in is deeply dire. And we've seen an increase in the difference of earnings between Black South Africans and white South Africans. If you take off the 10% of Black South Africans that have gained the most between 1994 and now, if you take them out, there's been so if you include them, there's been a decrease in income inequality between white and black South Africans. If you take them out, there's been a significant increase. So I think part of actually what we need to do is to actually understand the country we're in as it is, and how that then is different from what existed in the UDF, and how do we then respond for the country we're in, not the one that we want.
I think I'm going to ask one more question for the panel to respond to, and then we'll... to the court, you must force the government to intervene. The question is, you know, why does government not see some of these threats to its legitimacy and act on them? Why didn't it send in a company of soldiers to take over the town again? Because essentially the town is being run by gangsters, and that process is rippling out through, you know, through our society. Just some questions about and reflections about the, you talked about the vacuum at the center of our politics, but there's also a leadership vacuum. Somehow, again, you know, from the churches, from traditional business rather than sake liga, from the business community, from those who have some investment in the society functioning. Why are they not getting involved?
Okay, I'm gonna speak to your question by bringing back the conversation on organization. So I think there is organization and there is leadership, but it's not where we want it to be. I'm gonna out myself a bit. I live in not far from here in an area called, oh, you are from Cape Town, in an area called Wynberg. Upper Wynberg, so the white part of Wynberg. I'm from Joburg. I've been living there for 8 years, so it's shocking to live in a place like that. And I'm part of a neighborhood WhatsApp group. Very organized WhatsApp group. And it seems like the purpose of this WhatsApp group is to keep black people out of the area. And I mean, this is really, and they do it very well. The supposed pretext is we need to protect ourselves from crime. Crime is on the increase. SAPS is not responsive. Anyone who doesn't look like us is probably a criminal. And I'm not making this up, but people with darker skin than me can't walk on the streets of Upper Wynberg without being harassed by an ADT security guard, because of how well the community is organized. If somebody like that does walk on the street, a message immediately gets sent in the WhatsApp group. everyone within that area posts the video footage of where that person was. This happens within 5 minutes. And the ADT security van is then forced to escort that people to that person in. And in every single case, I've been living there for half a year. In every single case, it was somebody who was recycling or somebody who was walking to work, but they've been harassed and escorted out of the area. So there is leadership and there is organization, but it's right-wing leadership and it's right-wing organization, and people are and the crisis is forcing people to retreat and to isolate within themselves, within their communities, within people that look like them, are of the same class as them. It's not just happening in white areas like Wynberg. It's happening in the form of xenophobia. If we look at Operation Dudula, and I think one of the problems on the left is that we've been unable to provide real solutions to the crisis, whereas the Upper Wynberg Community WhatsApp group has a very simple solution, an easy solution to crime. You keep black people out of the area. And it works. Crime is probably decreasing in the area, right? And Operation Dudula is saying that foreigners are taking your jobs, and in the crisis of unemployment that we've just seen has worsened drastically. People are chasing people who are not like them out of their communities as a solution. And Operation Dudula has an incredible leader who is able to organize very well. So fundamentally, I think the crisis is one of imagination and our inability to imagine, and the death of our ability to imagine around political economic lines, like all the isms. We don't speak about those things anymore. We don't speak about ideology anymore.
So you're asking about the state and why the state is not functioning in the ways that it should to just do basic things, because it doesn't have to. There are no political consequences to a failing state for those who make it fail. Both the professionals in the system who are not only ill-equipped for their jobs or set up for failure, but literally will still get a promotion at the end, right? So there's no consequence and there's no political consequence. And that's the problem. There are no consequences. Now, who metes out consequences in a democracy? It's not, the politicians are not going to mete out consequences on themselves. The population, the polity has to give out the consequences. There must be a consequence for bad. So if I go to a upper class restaurant and somebody gets bad service, it's not the manager that then notices there's bad service. It's the customer that goes, hey, sorry, sir, sorry. Do you understand what I mean? That's how it works. And the polity in this country, we have stopped requiring better, and we've stopped meting out consequences for poor service, right? At this point, in our best forms, we go to strikes, to protests, and I was saying to somebody today who was saying, there's a health strike happening, should that be allowed? Should nurses be allowed to strike because patients are suffering? And I said, well, a nurse striking would matter if the politician cared that people were dying, but the politician doesn't care that a nurse not working is going to cause somebody to die, and so it's a lose-lose for the nurse and the patient. Because a caring politician would go, wait. Let me attend to your issue because people are dying. But because you don't have that and you have a politician that has no consequences, that's why we have that problem. And so we must start meting out consequences. Part of meting out consequences is about us reclaiming government. We must stop calling government their thing. That somebody else has, the ruling party governs and they have, no, it's our government. It's our government, it's our laws, it's our infrastructure, it's our resources. And this idea that we can just like build a society outside of a government that functions is nonsense. It's irrational, and it's part of the reason why we're in the problem that we are in. We cannot give up on government. We cannot give up on fighting for state power. We just can't afford to do that. The only way you do it is by just bunkering down, doing this kind of ethno, small, micro, personalized bunkering in of yourself and your family and your community. But you don't have a country. If you don't have a country, it doesn't matter how much you protect yourself, at some point the bottom is going to fall out. And so we must not give up on the government, we must not give up on the state, we must fight for the state, for the resources, for the laws of this country. We must fight for the state. We must not give it up to politicians who don't give a damn.
Can we throw it open to some questions?
Can I just say one last thing? Afrobarometer, their last survey in South Africa 2021, asked a number of questions on citizenship and participation. Just some, in the past year, have you done any of these things? Would you do this if you had a chance? Attended a community meeting. There was 20.7% that said several times, but the majority said no, but I would do it if I had the chance. That was 28%. But here, spoken to a local government councillor about a problem in the last year, 66.6% said never. Spoken to a member of parliament in the past year to give them your views, 93.9% said never. Spoken to a political party official to give them your views, 82% said never. Spoken to a traditional leader, 73.6% said never. So, to Tessa's point, those uncles and aunties don't feel any pressure to be responsive to any of us. And the problem is that the people that are the most insistent on speaking and trying to hold accountable through the protests are the people that it's easiest not to listen to and it's easiest to ignore. I remember when when we were doing the Right to Know campaign, organizing in 2010, and when we were organizing communities from Delft and other places, and I said to them, why are you guys joining? I said, they're all, well, this is a thing that's important to the media, the secrecy bill. It's a thing that's important to the media. So if we're with them on something that's important to them, then maybe they'll come with us on the things that are important to us. Because usually we need to burn something to get the media to cover our issues.
Right, we've got about 10 minutes for a couple of questions. Does anybody got a question? And I'll just repeat. Sir.
Tessa and Ste, I get your message that you say that we need funding and resources and so on. What I haven't seen from all these meetings that I've attended, I've never seen you guys roping in business people. I normally get Busi from Business Leadership South Africa and that other professor. They said they were prepared to pay for senior counsel to prosecute these Zondo guys if the NPA doesn't have enough resources. Lamola agreed that they will consider it. My point is this: if we don't have resources, let we at least bring them in, Kaskuvadia. And let us hear what they have to say as far as resources are concerned. And then there's another guy, I normally read the Financial Mail, Toby Shapshek, I hope I pronounce it correctly. He's a guru as far as technology is concerned. Perhaps we can bring him in because I know Barack, when he ran for his first time, He went for, what you call it, WhatsApp and so on and so on, for the youngsters and so on. That's why I had the youngsters. So my point is this, we shouldn't give up now and say, you know what, there's no resources and so on. Let's bring them in, let's hear what they have to say and what way they, because everybody's hurtful for this government. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree completely that there should be a business person on this panel. And I think we're speaking to each other in these, and that's what AfriForum has gotten very right. And that broader solidarity movement, because it's a whole movement, right, with the unions, with the civic education thing, and with the business people, with the academics, where they're all organizing, and they don't all agree all the time, but they're all having conversations together. Here, I think we're a bit icky about the business people, so we don't invite them to things, but actually that should be here. That's who should be here. And they're just as frustrated as the rest of us in terms of what's not happening with government. And yeah, so I think it's to the point that you're making around that convening, that it should not just be convening like-minded people. Or people that work in the same things that we do.
Just to add to that, one of the things we're going to have to get right as well. So big money is important, but small money is more important. So I keep saying I would rather have 1 rand from 1 million people than 1 million rand from one person. In organizing, that's more important, in fact. And so yes, and not only big business people must come to the table, they must definitely come to the table because their solidarity is going to matter in more than just their money, I can assure you that. But having the ability for people from all over this country to start contributing and start putting skin in the game and start looking at our salaries differently and saying, what part of my salary is going to go to organizing this month is a question I'm asking myself every month now. Is what part of what I have and where can I skim my fat? And I'm asking myself about how many less dinners am I having this year out? How much, I'm literally asking those questions to myself all the time. Because small money is really, really going to be important as well. And it's also important at a power level because if we rely too much on too many people who have big money, or this class of people that have big money comes with big influence. Minaj and I were talking about this earlier. And if I'm going to have one person give me 1 million, I want to have 1 million that comes from 1 million people to counteract the power balances between those two. And so I would encourage us all to start thinking about how we make small contributions.
Okay, I think that we could try and find solutions that deal with the symptoms of how we got here. There's a sense that the earlier governments and earlier democratic state that were ushered in was of a better quality and a higher standard, and they kind of got the objective right after apartheid, and that we deteriorated after a certain period. But it's that earlier government that cut budgets because they were servicing a debt. It's that earlier government that ushered in policies that means that an ICU nurse comes from an agency. So the issue is not, okay, no, it's not, I'm putting it wrongly. Of course, there's an admin issue that someone administratively didn't process the salary. But why is a nurse dealing with life and death from an agency? It is the earlier government that we thought was a much better government than the deterioration we're seeing now, that brought in Hitachi to build Madupi and Kusile that can't deliver, and doubled and tripled their costs. It's that earlier government to pay external debt, and I'm not passing judgment on it, but I'm saying that budget must be understood. That didn't start maintenance in Eskom. that gets us to where we are now. It's the earlier government that started freezing posts in the public service. So if you want to run a campaign on quality public service delivery, you can't have one nurse doing 4 nurses' jobs, and then the attitude is, oh, this one, she's just sitting eating chicken. So when we talk about consequences, so life Esidimeni happens, but it was inevitable. They shut down beds in the mental facilities under Mbeki's government and released the patients to the communities. So when life Esidimeni happens, the consequence we're looking for is one person with a bad heart, not a budget that didn't take care of working class patients with mental health issues. So part of what divides us is that we're at a point where our race, class, and gender divisions have deepened, right? And it's that earlier government that started the deindustrialization that gets us to this point, because they were signing trade and tariff agreements that went way beyond what was required. Now, so of course we must organize, of course we must not accept what is happening, and of course everyone's disillusioned, but we've got to get the basis of what happened right. I think it's populist and too easy to believe that we got to this point because we had a Zuma government and he was corrupt. Of course he was corrupt. No one's going to disagree with that. But quality public service delivery means you must have more police people. In working class townships, you must have a police van. You can't have one nurse coming from an agency. That nurse needs to be full-time employed. So I think that we have got to get the basis of our analysis a little dealing with the actual problem of an austerity budget, because a lot of what we see with the tender system is symptoms of that austerity budget. I'm sorry if I've complicated the discussion, but yeah.
You've taken us to our sort of deadline. I think we need to bring it to a close because we may want to just engage informally with each other, and we all need to be out of here within the next half an hour. But I think finally, the challenge is what do we do about the situation? What do we do about the election coming up? What do we do about getting organized, getting involved? What do we do about getting people to vote? What do we do about getting people to come together around setting an agenda for politicians that and working out the ways in which we hold them accountable? I think what the picture that has been painted is the loss of accountability, the loss of any consequences in the whole system. And we have to think about how each one of us re-injects contribution in terms of the radical solidarity that we need, but also steps up to demand consequences, to enforce consequences, to call out people who are taking advantage of the system. Thanks very much, all of you, for being here, giving your time. And I'm sorry that Bertha is an alcohol-free space, so we can't mingle and have a drink, but we can mingle and have some juice and water and catch up and compare notes. Thanks very much for coming. Look, yeah, this is the first town hall that amaBhungane has had since COVID, but I think each of the organizations that we represent here are going to be trying to be doing more of this in the run-up to 2024 and beyond. So, look out. Thanks. Okay. Thanks a lot.